Day 965 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 671,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,210 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, so 13 tanks, 44 APVs and 9 artillery, which appears to indicate a lull in artillery losses, though from what we can perceive on the battlefield is proportionately much fewer self-propelled guns being eliminated these days over towed artillery, and so much so that I was impressed to see this Russian heavy artillery 2S7 Pion 203mm SPG in use by the Russian armed forces, but I was less surprised about its targeting and destruction. So whether it's these Pions, the Mr. S or the Juzzie S self-propelled howitzers, which is pretty much their entire list of 152mm platforms or greater, we're just not seeing them at the previous volumes that we once did. Then we'll head across to the map and we'll start out in Russia's Maytime incursion into northern Kharkiv, where Ukraine's 13th National Guard Brigade, the south of Hliboka. Now this would be in follow-up to Ukrainian liberations from about 2 weeks ago, where we saw some land just southeast of Hliboka getting liberated as well. And overall, for this sector on the map, Russia has put themselves in a bit of a bind, because the grand image of their great army prevents them from simply withdrawing and redirecting resources to other parts on the map, as doing so would be a massive blow to the Kremlin's ego, which is something that the Kremlin gremlin is unwilling to accept. So instead, many of the Russian forces remain in place here, and not to achieve their initial goal of taking Kharkiv city, followed by an annexation 60 days later, but now it appears their primary objective has more or less shifted to merely holding onto the small territory of control they previously captured. Although that's not Russia's only problem in this sector, because right next door, at Zuralevka, in the adjacent Belgorod Oblast, we see token forces of the Russian army having to deal with the constant onslaught of targeted short-range attacks by the AFU, mostly from across the border. In fact, various settlements along the border between Belgorod and Ukraine, on the Belgorod side, continue to face what could be best described as a significant hassle for the Russian army, because these areas now contend with the very real threat of new incursion points by their adversaries, forcing the Russian military to take this relatively newly formed threat very seriously. As such, this shifts the previous dynamic of placing their soldiers where they desire it, instead now somewhat forcibly diverting resources to these border areas, pulling their attention away from key objectives like the Donbas, which puts the pressure on Russian manpower. And in that spirit, we'll head across to the Kursk region, to Ukraine's Kursk incursion, which is already a forever huge stain on Russian history, especially given the immense pride they have towards their own military. But to the northwest of this front, Russian forces since opted towards a full steam ahead approach just beyond Zeleny, which resulted in a number of armoured personnel carriers lost for themselves. And clearly, they look to push an attritional salient into the belly of the beast of Ukrainian captured territory, with a reported 50,000 personnel strong Russian army in Kursk, bearing in mind that volume services over 120 kilometers of contact points against the AFU. And so for this location on the map where the Russian forces have reached up to, has essentially made for a pocket formed by geographical features such as lakes and rivers to the east and the west, which at this point now directly affects their ability to come from those locations, where if the Russian forces continue on this front, it leads to an increasingly heavy reliance on their usage of somewhat narrow pathways that the Suja Highway travels through. Then there is also a number of reports coming out about the southeast of the town of Suja itself, where it said that the Russian forces are looking to put the squeeze on from the opposite side of the AFU incursion as a means to encircle and cut off Ukrainian positions. Though it is a lot of land to cover, with at least 20 to 25 kilometers to, say, make it out to the other side. Also compounded by the issue of non-ideal terrain and multiple townships to pass. Now, anything's possible, but I tend to visualize a high-ranking Russian commander, perhaps the inexperienced economist that now heads the Russian MOD, Belousov, thinking that this is a strategy that's worth a shot. However, realistically, Russia's real military strategies have always been about dealing less in military intelligence and dealing more in non-stop meat assaults, combined with artillery. Oh, but speaking of a lack of intelligence gathering in Kursk, some chaos erupted when Russian forces fleeing from Ukrainian FPV drones encountered unexpected dragon's teeth placed on evacuation routes by Russian forces themselves. This caused a major issue for vehicles of soldiers speeding at night as they then crashed into these obstacles, leading to the wounding of almost 150 Russian soldiers just over a single night. Russian military sources then expressed frustration about this latest series of events, noting the complete lack of markings or warnings about the barriers. Oh, then also in Kursk, Russian military correspondent Sladkov headed to the front in the region to film some reports. The trip turned out to be somewhat eventful for him, where we see him testing out a civilian motorbike with Ferrari red fairing, but perhaps they should choose to not document their non-standard issue two-wheel army so much. It's just a suggestion. Sladkov also found that he had to be cautious near to the front lines, keeping his head down due to the constant presence of FPVs and other unidentified drones overhead, forcing him to take frequent cover. Then we'll head down on the map to the Donbas, and briefly to Pokrovsk, where the lines haven't moved an inch in the past day. Although we did see a Russian tank and a Russian BMP infantry fighting vehicle get destroyed near the northwestern part of this front. So I do wonder about the lack of map changes in the last 24-hour period. Perhaps all that thinly veiled criticism directed toward the Kremlin from internal commentators on the Russian clusterfuck of a situation inside Kursk looks to have taken its toll on Moscow, leading to this location possibly no longer getting the attention we saw previously. Then we'll head just a little bit up on the map where we take a look at the close quarters combat urban battles of Toretsk, as members of the AFU said most recently that there is no longer not even one intact building or center left within the town. Also, the AFU's military spokesperson of the Operational Tactical Group Luhansk mentioned about the tactics employed by Russian forces in this region now, stating that Russian soldiers changed their military uniforms to civilian clothes to move toward Ukrainian positions, which is a tactic they use in other embattled settlements as well. Bit of a dick move, but the expectations are low. Then taking a look around on the map, because somewhere in the east, a column of Russian tanks, or thank our lucky stars, a column of Russian turtle tanks, were halted by Ukraine's Katia unit, where this was expected to have occurred somewhere on the Kharkiv front lines. Even a nearby Russian drone operator's command post was located and destroyed. Then also in the east, a tree-line hiding Russian T-62 tank was destroyed in the occupied Luhansk region. Z marks the spot on that one. Then also in the east, and to the weird and wonderful, as an eagle, the animal, snatched a Ukrainian Mavic drone in the Donbas and dragged it across the battlefield before the Mavic ultimately gained its freedom again. During the footage, where the drone gets a lift, we see a battle-scarred field and numerous abandoned or destroyed old Soviet Russian armored vehicles too. Then also in the east, we saw a damaged Ukrainian-operated MRAP International Max Pro somewhere in the Donetsk Oblast, with what you can label as evidence of the MRAP meeting its landmine or IED protection design specs, headed back to the shop for repairs. Then we'll head across to a little bit of news for today, and we'll start off with some Ukrainian hardware news, as the Ukrainian armed forces have seen a significant leap in the success of their drone operations by integrating artificial intelligence. Thanks to AI software, particularly from the US-based company Palantir, Ukrainian drones have improved their strike success rates from 50% to 80%. The Sacker drone is a prime example utilizing AI to identify personnel, tanks, and other targets while being resistant to electronic warfare jamming. The AI, trained to recognize Russian soldiers by uniforms, weapons, and movements, is now starting to give Ukraine a forward-moving critical edge on the battlefield, as some of these platforms have already been marked as combat-ready and deployed. Also for this story, there's a couple of things to put in context here, as the strike's success rate I just mentioned, which moved from 50% to 80%, that might not seem like much, but that 50% rate refers to the human-operated drone success rate, where Ukraine built up to that level from a 10% success rate at the start of the war. Which means AFU operators had been starting to push their upper limits of their capabilities in this skill set, which is still quite impressive. So now, to jump to the 80% mark, which is attributed to the enhanced AI technology, it's quite the jump and is expected to improve further, with increases likely to look at about 10 to 15%, possibly even more, virtually guaranteeing successful hits. But add to that, the AI drones will not only successfully hit their targets more of the time, they will also become much more efficient in inflicting maximum damage to those targets. Scary, I know. Then headed across to some Russian hardware news, and coming to a Russian army near us soon, because reports of North Korean troops in Ukraine are gaining further confirmation from Ukrainian partisans from occupied regions, where some training of these North Korean soldiers is said to have occurred. And so reportedly, Russia is allegedly forming a battalion of North Korean citizens based on a Burat brigade within their 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade. This new unit, with an estimated 3,000 personnel, is speculated to be deployed for combat missions near Suja in the Kursk region. And you know what? I happen to somewhat look forward to hearing these stories from upcoming North Korean POWs. Can you imagine these stories? First of all, they're in a foreign land for the first time in their life, from a country whose many citizens flee at the first chance they get from the oppressive regime. Secondly, it will be extremely interesting to see their level of training, and what unusual processes they've gone through that they speak about. Further to that end, the general quality of the soldiers, so their health, which I've not heard a great deal of good reports about on that topic from over the years. So their perspective will be a unique one. Because after all, the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea is hands down the most propagandized country on Earth. Then to round off the video with a few comic stylings of Russian state media TV, which deserves a spotlight again due to some of the utter insanity of the ramblings that come out of that end of Russian society. So in the first example, we see Russian propagandist from Channel 1, Olisa Laseva, sitting on a tank with a Soviet flag, claiming she's off to attack Kyiv and then after to Berlin. What a balanced journalistic mindset right there. Then also we had top Russian propagandist Syelovov, who wanted to make the point that, as a courtesy, Russia responded without nuclear weapons. Well, Russia doesn't do much out of courtesy, as we've come to learn. And fair to say, more out of greed or fear. Also, apparently nobody's going to stand up for old Europe as well. But my favorite Russian state media TV example was how Russian Deputy Gurilov said, quote, "We need to go to the western borders of Ukraine and create a grey zone on the territory of NATO countries," where the irony is clearly lost on him when it comes to Russia already trying this approach in northern Kharkiv, for what Putin previously referred to as the creation of a sanitary zone, which never materialized. But hey, at least it gave the armed forces of Ukraine a great idea of Kursk. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe if not already. Always, like I say, helps boost out the channel, spread the message, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.